views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Social Justice Forums. I am Daren, Jaime, and if you're asking the question, what is our show about? Well, we take a look at a lot of the inequities that people face in our community. We promote civic engagement, civic dialogue. We have some great guests, and we have some good topics of discussion that we try to bring of awareness to you. And so we want you to stay connected to us because the Social Justice Forum starts right now. And welcome back. The Fair Housing Justice Center is a not-for-profit civil rights organization that's aiming to eliminate housing discrimination, promoting policies that also foster open, accessible, and inclusive communities, and strengthen enforcement of fair housing laws. Now, the organization continues to change lives by empowering individuals to exercise their fair housing rights. We're pleased now to have the Fair Housing Justice Center's Vice President of the Board member, Lisa Darden, and then also board member and former president of Fair Housing Justice Center, Capello. And thank you both for joining us here on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
And I'll do ladies first. Lisa, when we talk about fair housing, obviously in New York City, a huge issue. We talk about housing discrimination. We talk about access to housing. We talk about affordable housing. But from your perspective, what does fair housing really look like?
Well, I think a lot of people think because this is New York City that it's an open market and you can move into any neighborhood that you want to. But our testing has shown, and lots of research has shown that that's not the case in New York. There are a lot of segregated neighborhoods. I was a tester for over 10 years for FHJC, and I encountered a lot of discrimination as a tester, but as a general Black person, I've experienced discrimination when I was seeking housing on my own.
And so, G, when we talk about fair housing and the work that you do, talk to us a little bit about the organization.
Well, the organization came about in around 2005, and it was started by actually a husband and wife couple from Washington, both of whom worked for the Department of Justice. And they were asked, as they were leaving the Department of Justice, to look into starting an organization that would do fair housing in New York. And they started that organization under the auspices of an organization called Help USA. And then after it was incubated, actually went out on its own. I became a board member shortly after it started. And the focus is to try to remedy systemic housing discrimination. The last time I checked, New York City, for example, was the second most segregated city in the country for Hispanics and third most for African Americans. And that says a lot for the city that many people think is a melting pot. But when you look behind the curtain, you find out things are a little bit different.
Yeah, at least when we talk about those numbers, obviously that's a huge disparity. And we know that in the midst of COVID, there's a lot that's been going on by way of evictions and things of that nature. Talk to us about the discrimination and the work that you guys are doing right now actively in addressing some of these discrimination issues.
You know, we do a variety of testing. And so in doing our testing, even now we're seeing new trends where technology is being used to discriminate against housing seekers, but as well as time-old types of discrimination against people using vouchers, discrimination based on race, sometimes family. If somebody has certain health issues, we see discrimination against people with disabilities. So there's a variety of discrimination that, time and tried and true, but at the same time, there are new emerging trends that we aggressively fight on a daily basis.
And when we talk about fighting on a daily basis, obviously we know the fight continues, and we know that there are things for affordable housing and people who are still trying to have access to be able to apply to places to live. How prevalent, Gene, are we seeing this discrimination across New York City?
Across New York City, it is amazingly prevalent. Most people don't think about it, but discrimination happens often and in many different forms. As Lisa was saying, people think about discrimination, they primarily think about race, but it also occurs with respect to gender, with respect to sexual orientation, with respect to family status, with respect to source of income. Source of income essentially means that there are people who hold federal and local vouchers, which will pay for the rent of a unit and are often rejected because of that. And that's against the law. So when these kinds of things occur, we encourage people to contact us, and we do investigations. And when I say investigations, we generally send out testers, many of whom are actors who volunteer their time to work with us. And those actors are usually matched to see whether discrimination actually exists. When someone goes and is refused an apartment, for example, you never know whether what the reasoning is behind it. They may tell you that, sorry, it's not available, but that may or may not be true. But our testing program often finds out the truth of these things. And my colleague Lisa can tell you a lot about that because she was a tester.
Yeah, Lisa, walk us through. I know that I've seen these occur on television, where people have been behind the camera and, go through the whole process. But walk us through this and talk to us about your findings.
Well, we do a lot of paired testing, and we do a lot of different type of testing, but I was involved in a lot of paired testing where, if we're testing, let's say, for example, discrimination based on race, I would be sent to inquire about an apartment. As a tester, we're just simply inquiring. We have no agenda. We just want to know, is there an apartment available or not? How much does, how much is the rent? What's the deposit? All those basic things that you ask when looking for an apartment. But when I am sent out, I've experienced many different things. Mostly I experienced supers, agents being very nice. And then I do the test. A white tester is sent either before me or after me to do the exact same thing that I did. And then the findings are that I was treated vastly different than my white counterpart. There were times where I was told there was no apartment available, and there was actually 2 to 3 apartments available at the time. I was quoted a higher rent. My white counterpart may be offered a discount on the rent, may be offered to change appliances, to make different renovations to the apartment to make it pleasing to them. Where I was not offered that. Sometimes it can even be basic things. We're not showing the amenities in the building. And sometimes the discrimination is so subtle, you just don't know that it's happening to you until FHJC contacted me and gave me the results and let me know that a lawsuit was going to be filed. Sometimes it can be a little bit in your face, and you can get a sense by the way someone's treating you that something is happening. But a lot of times you just don't even know. It's just a polite, there's nothing available, and you're, escorted out the door.
What's that like for you when you have the experience of thinking, hey, this could be the place that, I want to live, but then all of a sudden I find out that the process has been skewed and there has been discrimination. When you went through that process and to find out those results, how did that make you feel?
The best way I can describe it is soul crushing. Like, it's just, when I'm done testing, I don't get to take off my black skin and operate, in a different way. Once testing is done, I'm still black. And when I see the findings, it's so difficult because you feel like, as an African American, I do everything that this society requires of me, pull myself up by my own bootstraps, get an education, follow the laws and the rules, and then you go to look for housing and you're discriminated against. And in a lot of these cases, I made more money than what my test characteristics had. And so, and in neighborhoods that I would like to live in. And so it's difficult when you're out there and you're testing and you see your treatment, because now the curtain has been removed and you see a lot of times what's happening in the market. And so it's very difficult, and it can be draining as well when you think that you're doing everything you're supposed to do and it's still not good enough.
Gene, so here's the situation. Lisa's gone out. You've had her go out. Then you have a white tester go out. We find that discrimination has occurred. What happens after that, and how do you navigate that process?
Well, we analyze the results and see if there's a pattern. And if there is a pattern, which is often the case, then we will approach the owners, the agent, whoever, and if necessary, file a lawsuit against them. And then we discuss the evidence. One of the things that Lisa didn't mention is that these things are recorded. They're either audio recorded or audio and video recorded, wearing a wire, so to speak. And the evidence is right there. And if these things wind up being in court or some administrative organization, it's up to the defendants then to explain or go to trial or settle with us. And we've had many successes over time because we have the evidence. For example, I mentioned source of income. We recently settled a case in Riverdale in the Bronx, where a woman with 2 children had applied for an apartment, and she had a federal Section 8 voucher. She was told that they didn't think that applied and that they would not rent to her. She came to us and we did an investigation over quite a period of time and found out that her allegations were true. So we filed with the New York Division of Human Rights, and we recently reached settlement with them. And that woman and her children now will be living in an apartment in that co-op, and they will have a freeze on their rent. In other words, it won't be any higher than whatever the Section 8 voucher provides. And there were damages that were also available based upon this conduct. So, we're there essentially to try to do the things that the government should be doing, but often doesn't do.
So if there's a person out there that's watching right now and they want to have an opportunity to engage with you, they're having trouble or they feel as though they've been discriminated against, what's the process for them in terms of reaching you, and how does the process play out?
Well, they can reach us by phone, area code 212-400-8201, or through our website, fairhousingjustice.org. Our intake people will follow up with anyone who thinks that they have a complaint. We encourage people to do that, and that starts the process.
Yeah. Lisa, we talked about the process for you and what it felt like and what it and what it is. Is it quite bothersome that in the year 2022 that we're still having these conversations and still this work is needed?
Yes. I've done so many tests for FHJC, so I don't want people to think that every time I go out and do a test that it's discrimination is happening. There are a lot of people out there that do the right thing. There are organizations such as ours that do fight housing discrimination and that can help people fight for their rights and hold landlords and real estate agents accountable if they are discriminating. There are wonderful people that do bring complaints to us. We even have white people who bring complaints in because they found out that they got an apartment and their landlord stated that a Black couple came, or some couple of color came, and they are not, they were not going to rent to them. And don't worry, we don't rent to those kind of people. And they brought the complaint to us because they want to be in an inclusive community. They want to be in open and accessible communities. So though there is things happening, there is a lot of good that is also happening. And although we still have a long way to go, we have come a long way. And an organization such as ours are going to be here to make sure that we get over those finish lines, and whatever else emerges, we're going to tackle those things too.
Yeah. Jane, are we seeing more and more come across your door, given the fact that we know with COVID, we've had the moratorium that's now ended? With the moratorium ending, we anticipated that there would be more and more activity in the area of housing and fair justice. What are you seeing?
We're seeing something similar to that, Daren. Our organization started small. We had one or two investigative coordinators who handle a lot of the work. We are now up to 7 investigative coordinators because the volume of complaints has risen. And, in order to try to service this, we've had to try to hire more people to do it. But we're a nonprofit organization. We exist based upon, in some cases, government grants, as well as contributions from dedicated people. So we try to do our best. And I want to give a shout out to partners that we work with. There are a number of lawyers and law firms that work with us doing civil rights work, and as well as other organizations that we partner with from time to time in Long Island, in Westchester, and other parts of New York City. We can't do it alone. We're happy to have these partnerships, but the work is, as you mentioned, increasing, and we're just going to continue to tackle it.
Well, Gene, Lisa, I want to thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's much needed work. The problems do exist. And as we said, in New York City, we understand how minorities have been disproportionately affected when it comes to the area of housing, but glad to have allies such as you with boots on the ground on the battlefield trying to make sure that there's equity and justice for all. So thank you both for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daren.
All righty, Gene and Lisa, our guests here on the Social Justice Forums. Want you to stay with us. We got more show right after this.
When taking public transportation, don't touch your phone. Carry hand sanitizer and use it immediately upon leaving the bus or train. Avoid touching your face. If someone is coughing or sneezing, move away. Wash your hands with soap and water as soon as possible. Limit contact with poles. If possible, avoid rush hour. Don't eat or drink on public transportation. Keep your bag off the floor or other surfaces. Avoid directly touching turnstiles. Stay up to date with the latest from your local health department and CDC.
And welcome back to the Social Justice Forums. Recently, we had an opportunity to talk to Yasmeen Hamza, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Womankind. Womankind is an organization that actually provides multilingual and culturally responsive services to help survivors of domestic violence, human trafficking, and sexual violence. These numbers are on the rise, but our organization is playing an important part. We'll take a look at my interview with her right now. Yasmeen, I thank you for joining us. And when we talk about life, particularly for women that you deal with, it really centers a lot about abuse. And can you give us a little insight into how difficult it is for a lot of these women who've really suffered under this kind of abuse?
Yes, well, thank you so much, first and foremost, for having us today. So yeah, a lot of the survivors that we work with have experienced some sort of gender-based violence, and the work that we do works really across the lifespan. So it's working with, children and youth who have experienced different forms of gender-based violence all the way to older adults, recognizing that individuals who experience different forms of trauma at different points of their life may need different things. And so the far majority of the survivors that we work with are often immigrant survivors who are new to the country or have been here for a while. And so really being able to figure out ways to support them and figuring out what their path is, whether it's to leave an abusive relationship or to just talk to somebody and kind of seek a better understanding of what the resources are that are available. And so the way that we're able to really do and support survivors is through providing support through, I guess, two different ways. One, we have an emergency residence. We call it residence, but they're emergency shelters that are really able to support survivors for a period of time that are leaving an abusive relationship to really kind of figure out what their next steps are. The goal of the work that we do is to create a space of community for those survivors as they're really kind of engaging on that path. So it's providing counseling, it's providing information, referrals, helping them obtain housing, which is often extremely difficult for survivors in New York City. For some, it's learning how to use the subway system, learning English, and really kind of helping support them in that period of time while they're in our houses. But we recognize that in order to really address issues of gender-based violence within our community, we also really have to do the work with and in the community. And so in addition to our emergency houses and our residences, we have 3 community sites that are really in Asian enclaves, so in Brooklyn and Manhattan and Queens, where survivors who maybe have not left an abusive relationship or have but are living within the community can come in and access services and support. And what does that look like? Really, it's very similar to what happens in our houses, counseling. One of the things that I think we also do is we are a culturally specific organization that's focused on AAPI, Asian and Asian Pacific Islander survivors of gender-based violence, but we're open to serving anybody that walks through our doors, is really taking wellness practices that are already part of our cultures and our communities and integrating that into the work that we do. So in addition to the counseling and the legal services, and supporting around economic empowerment, we're also able to integrate wellness support as well in supporting them on their path. One piece that we also have is our 24-hour helpline that features a text and chat feature, which allows survivors to access us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in a multitude of Asian languages as well as Spanish, to really kind of talk to someone to figure out what their next steps may be, what resources are available. It's a space that family members and professionals can call. But we implemented our text and chat feature actually prior to COVID, which was amazing for us just because it was another opportunity for during COVID where survivors were sheltering in place that they could access us without having to talk. And it's both in English and in Chinese.
Yeah, you talked about COVID, and I can jump in here and talk a little bit about understanding. Talked with a lot of people in the service industry who said, listen, particularly during COVID, it became a time when we were seeing increased numbers, increased services. The demand was out there, but yet and still we didn't have the staff to be able to keep up. When we talk about abuse, we knew that abuse became even more prevalent during times of COVID. What was it like for you, your staff, and being able to really transition and pivot for the needs of your clients?
So, I will say I'm fortunate to work alongside amazing community within Womankind who pivoted really quickly. Our residential staff continued to work in the houses day in and day out. And we took all the necessary precautions to be able to continue to support our survivors as they were sheltering in place, as well as our staff who worked within our community sites worked to transition all of our services into remote. But if there were needs for survivors in person, we continued. What we actually saw at the beginning of the pandemic was a decrease in service calls. And I think that was due to the fact that people were having difficulty in being able to access services or know where to go. But what we did see was an increase in need of our current client base. And as the pandemic went on, we did see an increase in calls to our helpline and to our text and chat. But what we saw was there was an increase in food insecurity, an increase in job loss, and the impact of abuse was taking a toll on individuals' mental health. They were sheltering in place with people who were potentially harming them. And oftentimes, resources and supports that they had historically been able to use, such as the court system, were closed. And so, our staff really kind of figured out different ways to support survivors, whether it was sitting on the phone with them, helping them fill out a food stamp application, which historically they would have done together in person, or it was, for our older survivors, it was actually sitting and talking them through how to use Zoom or be able to kind of go to their doctor's appointments via, a virtual session, and really sort of figuring out ways to help them around food insecurity, getting them resources. Our staff really kind of came together to figure out what's available, how do we get it out to our survivors, and what are ways that we can continue to provide the support. So that included having our group work and our wellness work virtually and sending survivors some of the tools that they may need to be able to engage in that. And so, it was being creative in the ways in which we were able to support survivors, but recognizing that the needs of survivors hadn't really changed. They were just really exacerbated by the pandemic. And so we needed to continue to be able to respond, and recognizing that these needs are not as short term. Like it's not just that these needs are not just happening during the pandemic, but they'll continue and will have ripple effects. And so how do we continue to support and, create our services in a way that continues to meet the needs of our community members?
Yeah, I want to talk about one of the needs that you have, and that is to be able to deal with a multiplicity of different women who come from different backgrounds and most of all different languages. And so multilingual support is definitely needed. How have you been able to deal with that, given the fact that you have this great diversity of people who are your clients?
So we are intentional in bringing on staff that come from the communities that we serve, as well as are able to speak the language. And so one of the things that we do is work to ensure that any survivor that walks through the door are linked to advocates that speak their language. If we don't have that language, we find a resource to be able to support the survivor. But being a multilingual organization has been at it's from the foundation. It was why we were created in the first place. And so it's something that we continue to ensure that we're able to do, right? Looking for resources within our communities that meet our clients' linguistic needs, making sure that some of the stuff that we're able to provide is in their preferred language. And I think a big part of what we do, in addition to the service piece, is language access and language justice, and really advocating to ensure that systems that are required by law to provide services to our survivors in their preferred language are actually doing that. So in addition to that direct work, we are, in spaces to be able to advocate to ensure that the barriers oftentimes that our survivors have in being able to access services due to language, that we're addressing them, and that we are ensuring that our clients have those rights that they're entitled to.
You brought up the word barriers, and you were leading right into where I want to go, because I want to talk a little bit about what are some of those barriers that that you're seeing out there, that you're facing, that can really make the work more impactful, but these barriers that are particularly here in New York City.
So like I said, I think for immigrant survivors, language I feel like I've been saying language access for such a long time now, because that continues to be a barrier. Not being able to access a service in your preferred language makes it difficult to be able to get resources, whether it's being able to access public assistance or mental health services, or even housing, shelter services. Another barrier that we continue to see is housing. There's not enough affordable housing in New York City to be able to support survivors. In addition to that, the access to the resources that exist are oftentimes hard or take quite a while to be able to access. And there's barriers, in filling out the paperwork and how long that takes. And that creates ripple effects on survivors' abilities to really be able to lead the path that they want. And so, those tend to be barriers. I think just systems in general, the difficulty in being able to access a resource sometimes. I can tell you, as an English language, somebody that speaks English, I have difficulty understanding some of the applications and so forth. And recognizing that survivors of gender-based violence are not just coming to services with like organizations such as ours, but have to access the school system, have to access the housing system, have to access the public assistance system, the court system, and so many different systems, and like being able to support them in the different barriers that each system poses to be able to access support.
Yeah. Well, I want to tell people Yasmeen is the CEO of Womankind. And listen, for you, it's a 40-year anniversary coming up, an opportunity to celebrate the work that's going on. Talk to us about your 40th year anniversary and the celebration.
Yeah. So, I mean, Womankind was created in 1982 by a group made up of social work students and a student and different activists within the community that recognize that really nothing existed at the time that supported survivors, particularly Asian survivors of gender-based violence. And we've grown tremendously over the years to be able to incorporate different services and supports in different languages. But I think the foundation of why we existed continues, and all of us now stand on, the shoulders of all of those amazing advocates who really were at the forefront of that time during the women's movement and created something that was incredible. I'd like to say at 40 years, I wish we didn't exist, because that meant gender-based violence had been addressed within our communities. But, I think we're excited this year about being able to continue the work, really kind of focusing in on continuing to really amplify the voices of our survivors, ensuring that they're at the tables where decisions are being made that impact them. really ensuring that we're addressing the systematic barriers that are oftentimes impacting communities of color in particular, and really being able to think about what is it that we need to do to deepen our work to be able to support survivors in the ways that they want, right? A lot of how we were built and how we continue to kind of be is we work alongside our communities and listen to our communities. Our programs are shifted and shaped based on what we're hearing of what they need. And that's something we'll continue to do, in our 40th year. But we're just, really excited about, where we've gone and what the future holds for us. And really continue to be committed to addressing gender-based violence and really working alongside our communities to address, the issues around social justice, around, talking with our communities and working alongside of our communities to really kind of rise above violence and address those issues head on.
And so as you talk about 40 years, we talk about the fact of an organization had to be here to deal with the needs that are occurring out there, the abuse, the things of that nature. I guess the point that I'm making is years ago, that voice was muted. And when we look now, it seems as though the voice of survivors and those who've encountered abuse have a lot more support and a lot more wraparound services and more listening ears. As you look and project for where you're trying to go, what can the community better do to assist in being assist you in being a credible messenger, and not just a credible messenger, but also by providing some supportive services to some of your clients who are some of the most beautiful people, but yet and still find themselves on the other side of abuse?
So I think, what is it that community can do? I think community is already doing some of, the work, and we're really just working alongside of them. I think, when the organization started, no one talked, like you said, about domestic violence or sexual violence. And we're at a place where people are talking about it. But it's that continuing conversation, looking at ways that community can kind of work to address it, not just the systems that, not just the criminal legal system, but what are ways we as communities can really kind of come together and talk about the issues and find ways to come up with innovative solutions to address them outside of maybe, the different systems that oftentimes create barriers for survivors. I think community members continue to elevate the voices of survivors, really listening to them and hearing from them. What is it that they want? What supports is it that they want? And how do we work together as a community to really kind of address those issues? And I think, as far as we've come, there still continues to be barriers within our systems, particularly for communities of color. And I think until we as community members work to address those barriers, we're going to continue to see similar issues. So I think it's, I've watched over the last maybe 4 or 5 years, people being more aware of the issue, being aware of the barriers, and really working to address them both on a city level, state level, federal level. And I think that's kind of where we're looking to the future, is that continuing alongside of them, working alongside, coming up with innovative solutions, and really continuing to address those systems that our communities continue to face.
Yeah, well, we want to thank Yasmeen for being with us and the great work that you're doing. Congratulations on your 40-year anniversary. And we would love to have you back to come and talk more about the work that you're doing and the impact that it's making across the city. Glad to have you.
Thank you so much for having us today. We really appreciate it.
Yasmeen, Hamza, our guests here, and we want you to know that we've got more shows, so please don't go anywhere. We'll continue with more social justice coming up after the break. welcome back. Our next guest recently proposed a bill preventing rideshare companies from charging higher prices during federal, state, and city-declared emergencies. Now, the proposal comes after the recent subway attack in Brooklyn on April the 19th. Joining me now to share more is the New York State Assemblymember of District 85, Kenny Burgos. And Assemblymember Burgos is glad to have you here, and our first time really doing this, but hopefully won't be the last. And thanks so much for sharing with us.
For sure. Thanks for having me, Daren. I hope it won't be the last either.
Yeah, let's talk about this here. As we said, you put this proposal out after the subway attack on April 19th. Walk us through your reasoning for this legislation.
For sure. I mean, I think we all saw what happened that morning in New York City, and it was a horrific event, to say the least. But, one little piece that really stuck out to me was people were on Twitter and Instagram really complaining about not being able to leave the scene, whether you were directly impacted or not. Obviously, public transit was heavily affected. And, we had Ubers and Lyft that were charging, sky high rates. And now I've spoken to Uber and Lyft, and I know, it wasn't in a predatory way, but we want to avoid this ever happening. I know they've done the right thing by refunding this money, but I think we should find a way legislatively just to avoid this from ever occurring if it unfortunately happens again.
What was the response that you got from them? I mean, obviously they said they didn't do it in a predatory way, but they did do something because they actually raised the prices for people who are in the middle of a drastic emergency.
Yeah. So their argument was that this is all algorithm based. So obviously they're not privy to an emergency going on. The algorithm will just see a high demand, and then they will then just raise the prices. So we're trying to find a way to get the language right to make sure that, again, we can differentiate what is an emergency and then what is just a normal business model.
Yeah. Did you hear a lot from the constituents in your area about this? Were a lot of your constituents affected?
I wouldn't say a lot. I mean, this is obviously in Brooklyn, but it's regardless. I represent a portion of the Bronx in the state of New York, and so I have a duty to make sure as a whole are protected from scenarios like this. And if we have a way to create policy, to pass a law that prevents activities like this from happening again, then we have a responsibility to do so.
Yeah. Let's talk about the 85th for a minute. That's your district. And obviously, as you said, you don't represent Brooklyn. You do represent the Bronx, and the proud assembly member of the 85th Assembly District. Talk to us about what do you see happening in your district and the things that you're acting on right now?
Yeah, so my district covers Soundview, Hunts Point, Longwood, and also Rikers Island. But the issues that we face here in my district are the same issues we face in the Bronx and New York City. People are struggling with rents. People are looking at a lot of wage inequalities. People are want to make sure we have better access to public transit. I mean, you name it. So there's a lot of stuff for us to handle here in the state. We just passed a New York State budget that I think helps a lot with families and individuals here in New York. But the work really never stops.
Yeah. And we talked about Rikers Island. That's being part of your district as well. We know that the close for Rikers Island has been called. What can you bring us up to speed as far as Rikers Island is concerned?
Well, the plan is to close it by 2027. It's still the plan in action. The mayor has committed to closing the barge, which is situated on the water. So we're still talking with the administration to make sure that happens. But you have now the feds that have even come down and said that we need a better plan. I mean, Rikers Island has really become a failed operation. You have people dying, literally dying, that have not been convicted of crimes. You have individuals just facing just horrible conditions. And I mean, individuals both incarcerated and the correction officers and the nurses. I mean, you have to understand there's a lot of people that operate on this island, and it has proven to just not operate correctly. So I think the city has to come out with a plan soon and propose to the feds. If not, the feds have mentioned a possible takeover.
Yeah. There's talk of what's happening in Rikers Island, and part of that is the reinstated TAP funding for incarcerated individuals. For somebody who may not be so familiar, explain to our viewers a little bit about what this means.
Yeah, so prior to 1995, incarcerated individuals always had an opportunity to apply for TAP, which is Tuition Assistance Program. Many people may be familiar if you've been to SUNY or CUNY or attended a university in New York. But then post 95, when we had the war on drugs, when we had, the tough on crime era policy, under Pataki, it was removed. So for the past 25 years or so, you've had incarcerated individuals unable to access this funding to go to college. We want people to rehabilitate themselves, want them to do better, come back into society, a much more well-rounded and, a better individual, but we have not given them the resource to do so. So I'm really proud of this budget this year that we've reinstated that amount. So now people who are incarcerated can actually take that time to rehabilitate themselves, come back into society, hopefully even with a college degree, get into the workforce, raise a family. And I mean, that's exactly what we want to see.
Yeah. When you talk about legislation, you've been pretty busy yourself. And I think there's some people who are really, want to shake your hand and really get an opportunity to talk to you about this one here, because you put in a bill talking about reducing the actual work week. So walk us through a little bit about what that entails and what would happen for New Yorkers if passed.
Yeah, I mean, we can go on this bill, but, I talk to folks and I think it's very apparent that work and the way we structure work is changing and has probably permanently changed due to the pandemic. You have a lot of companies that have switched to hybrid models. You have companies that have switched to entirely work from home models. I think Airbnb has just announced that they're going to allow any of their employees to work from anywhere in the globe, no change of pay. And they've still proven that they can be effective and productive. The 40-hour work week was modeled during the Ford assembly line, kind of brought about the 40-hour work week. Since then, we have tremendously improved productivity. We have tremendously improved efficiency. We have proven that we can work from anywhere, pretty much in the globe. So with that in mind, I think it's time we start talking about a much better work-life balance. Americans have just been so focused on work and burnt each other out and efficiency, and we can still have this efficiency and productivity, I think. So my bill, it would change the 40-hour overtime law and push it down to a 32-hour threshold, which would essentially, hopefully, bring about the 4-day work week, which I think will be an effective and productive model for years to come.
Talk about your critics, because I know they're out there and they're saying that this is not a good idea, given the fact that we've got a hard time finding people to work right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would always push back and say we don't have a hard time finding people to work. I think part of that is people have questioned, what do I want to do for work? How do I want to balance my life with work, right? Is the pay enough? And I think there's a real reckoning. There's a real happening right now. And this is the moment where we can talk about the work week shift, right? There was a lot of critics back when the 40-hour work week came in. I mean, prior to that, people were working 6-7 days a week. That was standard. 10, 12 hours a day. That was a standard work week. And it seemed insane to have people only work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week back then. So, we're going to have to talk to the critics, but I think history will look proudly upon us for years to come.
Yeah. As we enter into the summer, obviously, we are preparing ourselves to really navigate. We're seeing numbers continuing to rise with regards to COVID infections in New York City. What are we seeing in your district by way of infection, by way of being able to recover?
Well, I mean, the same as New York City. New York City, unfortunately, has just moved into, I believe it's called the yellow zone. Saying that we just have a lot more cases coming about. So we're stressing people to just, the same protections and safety measures that we have learned over the last 2 years. Please implement those. Obviously, if you haven't been vaccinated or boosted, we're encouraging folks to get that done. But thankfully, I believe the science has shown that COVID has decreased in terms of severity, the dangerousness, to death and serious illness, which is a great sign. I'm hopeful that we move into a space where COVID, really does become just similar to a seasonal flu. I mean, we know we can't eradicate it completely at this point, but New Yorkers just have to stay vigilant, just use the measures that we have learned and live your life as safely as possible, but still getting done what you have to get done.
Yeah. And for yourself, I think a lot of people have talked about during the pandemic as an elected official that a lot of our areas really struggled with sometimes with access to resources and information and things that proceeded to get better after a while. Talk to us about that right now. Do you feel comfortable with the access to resources, vaccination opportunities, supplies that are necessary? Are you comfortable with what you're seeing in your area?
I think New Yorkers led the charge in terms of vaccination resources and accessibility, and it's no different from my district. I think there's a fair amount of access. There's certainly no lines at this point. I would love to see maybe a bit more, increased testing and access to PPE. I mean, we do know that PPE is sometimes prohibitively expensive. I've seen people still to this day that, reuse masks over and over, which is kind of counterintuitive to the hygiene protocol. So maybe we can always do better in that space. But it's a conversation to have with our city, our state, and even federal partners, because we're not out the weeds yet. So we still have to provide those resources.
Yeah. Let me take a little ride up the interstate, the Deegan, if you will, go into Albany and talk a little bit about the work that's going on there. You yourself came out and said when it comes to the 421A tax break that you are kind of like glad that it's not going to be included in the delayed state budget as it's still being talked about in Albany. So for first, our viewers who may not be familiar with 421A, let's give them a little history as the 421A and what your position is right now.
All right, I'll try to keep this concise. So 421A is a almost 50-year tax credit that's been on the books in the state of New York in one version or another. And this has been kind of on the books to help incentivize development. Back when the city and the state were in a real financial predicament, if you will. But now we've looked at it, we've looked at the data, and 421A has just been a tax giveaway to developers. And the new proposal that came to the state just a few weeks ago, I was completely against because one, it's a giveaway, and two, it did nothing to protect the people who live in my district now in the Bronx and protect people just to have actual affordable housing. It would have been basically a giveaway to developers to, no tax, no property tax for 35 years on your property, and you only give us 25% permanent affordable housing, quote unquote, leaving 75% of all units developed would have been at market rate. And we know when you talk market rate in new developments, in emerging neighborhoods, especially the neighborhoods in the Bronx, it's not meant for the neighbors that are there. So I was completely against it. I'm thankful we didn't pass it in the budget. And now the discussions continue while we're in session until June.
Yeah. And as we talk about affordable housing, I want to talk because we see housing that's being developed. And I think that's what a lot of New Yorkers are saying, and particularly those in the borough of the Bronx and probably in your district as well. We're seeing housing development, but it being developed, but it doesn't look like it includes us. It looks like it's something around us, but we're not included in the process. What kind of conversations are residents having with you when it comes to affordable housing and them being unhappy about the development?
Yeah, well, that's exactly that. I think you have people across the gambit. Reality is we need more housing, right? The reality is in New York City, the demand is so high and the supply is so small that we have people doubling up, tripling up, having a roommate or two has just become a standard thing. That was not a standard thing just a decade or two ago. And it shouldn't be the standard. If you're either a single adult or a couple just making a decent living here in New York, you should be able to afford a house, purchase a house, rent a house on your own. But it's just not the case right now. So as policymakers, we have to be deliberate in making sure that we're incentivizing housing being built, but we have to make sure that housing is going to be for neighbors that have lived in these neighborhoods, right? People think sometimes when new housing is built, they automatically brand it as gentrification, which is certainly the case in some ways, right? But if you do it the right way, if you do it with a surgical knife, it won't be gentrification, it's integration, right? It's that increase of housing, but you're still making sure that people who have built those neighborhoods, who have lived there, raised their kids, can still afford to live there. And that's just the way we have to approach it. So I'm hopeful we can do it this way. I'm hopeful we can produce housing in New York City and New York State going forward, but do it in a very precise and surgical way that it promotes integration and not gentrification.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I just want to have an opportunity to ask you a little bit about what people can look forward to as we are approaching summer in your district. Give people an opportunity to know if they're in the 85th, what they can look forward to.
Oh yeah, I mean, once I'm back home out of Albany, I'm always in the district on the streets. We do our back to school giveaway. We're talking about maybe doing some concerts this summer. I might even host some workouts, some events in Downview Park, my favorite park in the city of New York. But just follow my Instagram, my Twitter, Facebook. Everything is at Kenny Burgos NY, and you can see what we're doing. We'll be posting flyers, and stay tuned.
All right. Well, we want to thank you so much for joining us, Assemblymember Burgos, Assemblyman of the 85th Assembly District, joining us here on the Social Justice Forums. Thanks for being with us and sharing and giving us some insight.
Thanks so much, Daren.
All righty. Well, we want to let our viewers know that we are at the end of today's show. Want to thank you for taking the opportunity of joining us here on the Social Justice Forums, where we actually continue to elevate the conversation and bring you dialogue and talk about the issues that matter the most. We spend a lot of time talking about the inequities that people face, but we also give opportunity and give space for people to have a creative voice to be able to address some of those inequities. We hope we did that today on the Social Justice Forums. We hope that you join us next week as we continue to bring you more of the issues and the people that matter. I'm Daren Jaime saying thank you for watching the Social Justice Forums. We'll catch you next week.